Thank you and welcome everyone for joining us on the sheep and goat weaning management workshop and webinar that we have on this evening. At this point, we have 43 people on representing our webinar from across the state and across the country. So myself and Dr. Joe Armstrong will be attempting to provide a diverse amount of information relative to what we would have tried to accomplish here, particularly as we get through the late spring, early summer for those spring-born both lambs and kids. Again, there's more things probably alike than different relative to this topic, and we will do our best to segregate them based on species as necessary. But a majority of these are generalized information. And so if we look at it of when we are going to weaning, this should be a planned activity. And so we want to know when we're going to do that because we can think ahead and at least have some of the things going for us and going in the right directions. We'll discuss and talk about that as we move through this program. It's a critical time, and Dr. Armstrong will talk about the importance that stress has on animals, but we want to try to make this a low stress as a possibility, an option as we can, and it's something that we need to keep in consideration as we think about it from animal health and from animal welfare. And so we're going to touch on things that can be beneficial for both the maternal females of the ewes and the does, and then also the progeny of the lambs and the kids. So in generalities, a weaning timeline is most commonly accomplished for our sheep industry at about 60 days. And in fact, our National Sheep Improvement Program collects information so that they can be able to evaluate weights of those lambs at the considered weaning weight, and it's adjusted to 60 days. I would expect for the most part as we compare from one species to the other is that there's a little bit more leniency. And in fact, particularly with our goats, is that people are willing to keep those animals on those goats for a little bit a longer period of time. And those can be for a couple different reasons. So at least for most of the ewes, and maybe a little bit later for the does, is that the milk production has happened there 3 to 4 weeks after parturition. And so we're already decreasing it. And so once we get to that time period, particularly if we've allowed some transition feeds, and that's why we can have our creep consumption available for those animals, is that we're going to have an increase in the amount of high energy and concentrate diets that we'll have. And truthfully, it's probably just best in terms of what those animals are consuming at that point to get those mothers and the progeny to go in a different direction so that they can both be a little bit better as they both move on in their productive life. Again, the ewes and the does are going to be decreasing after we get to that 60 days for certain, and we can be able to, again, we've maximized that mother and progeny or offspring bonds and relationships, and consequently can get past to our weaning portion of the supply chain. So I put up primarily some pictures here that we can just talk and discuss. And one of the initial things there is that in the middle is that I have a scrapie tag. And so that scrapie tag can and should be used for any marketed animals that particularly leave your operation, if they're for breeding purposes or of breeding age for certain. But I like to use it in every one of them. And again, that's going past and above and beyond the regulations that we do have. But we can be able to use that as certainly an identification, or be able to identify what you possibly can. And we have another alternative that can work very well for us. And I show a goat's ear of how a tattoo can be used, and then the identification of one that was A24. With some of our animals that we work with, we can decide to put the corresponding ear tag, and then put the tattoo, if we so wish, or another tag in the other ear. So even if you do lose one of the identification options, that you're still okay on terms of moving forward. So in the top left, relative to management, and hopefully we've done this potentially a little bit before this, but and again, we could talk about that. We should have accomplished that before this point in time, but certainly the disbudding or dehorning of those animals should have been something that should have been accomplished. If you so chose, it would also be ideal from a lastration or band there towards the tail. On the bottom left is shown probably as good as industry accepted location. Again, there's plenty of opinions on how tight or how far of long of a tail one could and should leave. But here, if you put it at the end of the caudal fold or where that skin hits the tail, you'd certainly be in an acceptable location for most. Both rams and or buck kids can be castrated if you so choose. We'll talk about those options at a little bit later, but for the most part, individuals can do that early in their lives, or if at the very least potentially before weaning, if that's something that you so choose. Intact rams and bucks do make it to auction and to harvest if people choose that alternative, but you can make those decisions with more information on what your target market is and what your target goals are. The last thing that I have up there is actually the hoof trimmer or clipper, and in fact, there was once a time when they were two, truthfully, knife or scissor blades and just the fulcrum in the middle. And these were actually initially designed more so in tree pruners, but it's the only thing that I use anymore in terms of sheep and goat hooves. They work really, really well. They can be available at lots of different places, and they're super. Obviously, on our young animals, that isn't something that we have to accomplish right then. But maybe it's a time of when you're getting out those does or ewes to get a step ahead of it and try to be a little bit ahead of where you need to be in terms of hoof trimming. So this is just a quick slide and pictures of what can be called soremouth or orf. And again, I'm surrounded by talented veterinarians and colleagues on this call as well, but I could provide the introduction. And the ones that are on the left show truthfully ones that are just starting. And if this becomes a challenge, you're going to want to find this as quickly as you can. And the one on the right is still really in a moderate location. This can become very, very negative to the appearance. It can become negative to the animal's mouth. And more importantly, it can be negative to the ewe or doe if that's transmitted to the teat. Then they're not going to allow them to milk and nurse, and then we don't have a healthy baby nor a healthy mother, and we become some challenges. Many people choose not to vaccinate for soremouth and say, it's okay, I'll wing it, we'll play the lottery, and can go years or decades without ever having any challenges of soremouth. But if it does happen, it's something that you want to get under control as quickly as you can, and isolate those animals, because it's going to spread, and it's going to spread quickly for those animals. What's even more challenging is I put the word orf, O-R-F, because soremouth absolutely can be transmitted to humans. And if I was to think about this, nothing positive would be coming to mind. And so it's certainly something that we want to stay as far away from if we can, because it is extremely contagious. So I want to touch on facilities as a whole for just a little bit here. And as we look at it from the water system and making sure that our animals do have access to water. And so I put that as the first item there on purpose, and because a lot of times we overthink that one. And so we need to have access to water, preferably clean water. And no matter the experience that I work with on small ruminant producers, that sometimes seems to be something where you didn't get everything put together, or maybe that could be just a little bit cleaner. Some people choose to use a shop vac and even out of automatic waters and clean those out as best they can. But whatever we can do to make sure that it's fresh and not causing challenges either from molds or algae or just contamination in general. So shelter and bedding is going to truthfully depend on the year. Okay, so we're in the beginning of May in Fargo, North Dakota for me, but at least it's a beautiful time. And the only challenges in particular would be if you wanted to have a little bit of shelter relative to if there were larger amounts of rain or thunderstorms at this standpoint. Bedding not nearly as challenging as it is in a February North Dakota or Minnesota type day. And so differences, you might not have anything. And so that just depends on the year, truthfully, as we look at this. But one thing that we're probably going to have, and one thing that could provide some emphasis, is our fences and our pens. And so if we can be able to working on what our plan is. And I said at the beginning is that we want to have our plan of what we are going to accomplish with our fencing and our pens for our operations, and then the feeding equipment. So how are we going to do that? And we'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. I put this slide up here with two different options relative to an electric fence and that can be used and be able to keep these goats in. Those can be several different options. In fact, truthfully, we could have whole seminars on relative to fencing options for producers. But I need to identify what works for you. And of course, if not, those goats are going to go, and particularly the goats, but also the sheep, identify their own locations and options and maybe travel the world. You never know. And that's not the case that we want to have, because hopefully we can keep them under control. Here's one example in terms of a feeder as well. This is actually just primarily for the high forage diet, and put hay in with a 4x4-inch wire panel, and then those animals can dig in there. The other thing that's different between sheep and goats, primarily in this one, that I like to keep in mind is that obviously several of these goats have horns, and so if you get the locations too large, if a sheep was to get its head in there and it became stuck, then that would become a challenge that would have a problem. But if the goat does that with their horns and it becomes open enough, obviously, as you can think about that logistically, it's just simply not going to be able to be good to have it come back the other way. And so keeping those small enough that we can maintain those animals in line in our fences. And in fact, we've opened a can of worms relative to fencing and keeping animals in line and coordinated. But we hope that we can provide some options for you, or you can learn from your neighbors as well. Don't forget to know that your neighbors and other colleagues have been doing this and can be a resource for you. And so that's one of the first places I would step. Feeding methods, self-feeding of those animals saves labor because you are also providing all those feeds out in a self-feeder. And then primarily you're going to have grains. And so you might use a cottonseed hull or a different forage or alfalfa in a pellet to increase the amount of forage that you're providing for them. But for the most part, it's going to be a high energy, high concentrate diet. You have the option of hand feeding those lambs potentially, and goats, and potentially in the morning and in the evening. And one of the things that you can do from that standpoint, if you have a smaller amount, is that you can be able to identify which ones aren't eating, which ones potentially are sick, and you have more control of those. We could certainly choose pasture as well, and we can also do a combination of those if we so choose to have pasture early and then finish those lambs and kids on grain. We know and we can realize that if you so choose to keep those animals on a pasture-based system, it's just going to take longer time because of the conversion of feed to gain won't be nearly as quickly as what we would expect by providing the high concentrate and increased energies in the diets of our more concentrated in grains and feedstuffs. So I'm going to talk about this just for a little bit, and of course Dr. Armstrong is going to reiterate it as well, and he's our trained veterinarian, so we'll let him discuss it as well. But an introductory portion on enterotoxemia, or what can be considered overeating disease, can cause a challenge. And so most of the time, it's obviously this particular challenge is not coming to the ones that are running behind. It's the ones that are the fastest gaining and the largest, and maybe your favorite or whichever one it is. And that's when it hurts even more, I guess, to me. But they're ones that are going on the right pace, and we'll talk about how we can be able to improve on that. But we have the antitoxin that we can use. It's effective for about 2 to 3 weeks. I believe that we should, or that we can vaccinate the ewes 1 month before lambing. We should also vaccinate them 2 times prior to weaning. So let's say we have those lambs, or if they're in a group pen, and then we vaccinate it with the Clostridium C and D and T for tetanus, and then do that 30 days approximately prior to weaning, and then at weaning. And then anytime that we're moving or changing the feedstuffs that we have for those animals, we can try to be able to provide that for them, because it's that transition in the rumen and in the body that becomes more of an issue. So we can provide creep feed for our lambs. Those young lambs will increase with weight. And again, it's that transition. At North Dakota State University, we simply use the crushed soybean meal there as an option to get those lambs going. It's palatable. Some people might even choose to, to put a little bit of a molasses on it. Sounds like you're putting maple syrup on grits maybe or something, or whatever they were using. If we transition those animals towards a complete pellet and a quality hay that we have, then we can transition them. But again, we want those animals to have alternatives other than just the milk, and then we'll move towards kind of some of that shelled corn, soybean meal, aramias, and ammonium chloride, and trace mineral salt. So I found this information from actually research that was primarily done at the University of Minnesota in the 1960s. And in fact, this is showing the preferences of animals at different stages and points of their time. And so I found this extremely intriguing that in those 0 to 2 months, when given the option to consume any of these, the animals chose soybean meal as a large part of it at 0.81 pounds. And then in the 2 to 4 weeks, again, that was a preference that was something that they would prefer. You see it increasing there as we move to 4 to 6, but also you see the alfalfa hay increase. And the alfalfa hay, because the rumen is now working, the rumen and the digestive tract is now transitioned. It's being able to ferment some of those forages. And then as you move to 6 to 8 and 8 to 10, you'll see two things as well, is that primarily they're the corn grain, and also even historically there with the whole oats, those have increased as well. And so they can transition to more of a grain-based diet. We can wean as early, as I said, as 60 days. If you so choose, you can move it back to 120 days. Familiarity with their feeding system and that method can be beneficial, because if we have those animals, that you want to know that the ewes can see the lambs and the does can see the kids and vice versa, because they feel more comfortable. We have the shelled corn, soybean meal, hay and supplement that we can have. And then just having a quick understanding of where your target weight is. Yours might be different than these, but these would be industry potential options for us. And then again, when we're changing that grain ration, being able to make sure that we have access to our Clostridium perfringens C and D. I put this up here primarily for entertainment, because as I was thinking about just balancing this, is that it's not rocket science, but then again, it is animal science. And so I'm on both sides of this, because it can be as easy as that if we provide a grain or a high concentrate diet and also provide forages such as a grass hay or an alfalfa hay, our animals, for the most part, are going to gain, and they're going to do well, and hopefully they will be healthy. If we wish to maximize that and get animals growing as quickly as they can, or to reach different markets, or we have differences in feedstuffs, maybe we have the soybean hulls, maybe we have dry distillers grains, maybe we have field peas or canola or something in between. And so then it becomes more challenging, but entertaining for those as well. And so again, talk to your nutritionist that may be in the area, talk to your neighbors, and in general here with our growing and finishing rations, just as looking at it, we increase the amount of corn, and this is for weights primarily of sheep. Those would be lower numbers if they were goats, but increase the amount of our high concentrate diet as we decrease the amount of alfalfas or hays that we have in our diet. We're also, as those younger lambs are coming, is that we're going to have a higher level of protein, and we can decrease that as they get closer to a marketed weight. With our ration, and I pulled this actually out, this is from many years ago, and in fact, it's probably higher protein than what we need, but it certainly is. And if we were at 16 to 18, that'd certainly be fine, but we want to be 2 to 1 or 2.5 to 1 on calcium to phosphorus. And we have corn, soybean meal, molasses, limestone to help us out from a calcium standpoint, our salts, ammonium chloride that will help us as well in terms of balancing challenges on urinary calculi, additional selenium, vitamin A, D, and E as well. So urinary calculi, I touched on that a little bit, and in fact, it's not worth putting a picture because it sounds and isn't very entertaining, because what we have is we have mineral or potentially blockages in the urethra or of particularly rams and commonly wethers. if they have a high energy diet. So we had a challenge from that calcium to phosphorus ratio. One of the contributors can be early castration, but also if they are not getting enough water, if we have an intake, a higher phosphorus intake, as I said, and pygmy goats would potentially have more of it, just in terms of the diameter of the tract of the animal. So if we could provide ample water, that helps us. Ammonium chloride can help us. If we are able to have a later castration, increasing the salt increases the amount of water that they want to have. Limestone increases our calcium. A good quality forage helps our calcium and also the exercise. This is a quick slide of things that are available. I've already talked about ammonium chloride, differences on the tetracyclines that would need to be provided with a veterinary feed directive, and then also different options that we have for coccidiostats that can be involved. And in fact, my talented friend, Dr. Joe Armstrong, is going to take that one in terms of how we can address those topics. So just a quick few focuses here, and we will pass this on to my co-presenter. But I can't talk about weaning management without talking about the ewes for just a second. And so if we have these animals, we need to start a week before and try to get those ewes on primarily a roughage. They don't need any grain or protein supplements at that point. We're already on week 6, week 7, week 8, week 9 post-parturition. Most of their large amount of milk production is over, and we want to dry those ewes up. And so we want the lambs to then work to eat more creep, and it's a transition for both the lambs and the ewes. Then we can wean those lambs with a minimal amount of stress, and we want to make sure that we can make it through the next year with less udder problems. We're going to feed a low-quality forage and about as low a quality as you can, of whether that's a grass hay or even straw. And so then they're not getting that energy, not wanting and not being available enough to produce as much milk prior at that weaning portion. And then if we can limit the ewe's consumption of water, then they're not wanting to push that. I can't particularly advocate of taking all water off for those animals, but we want to limit that, and it'll help us get there. So a couple of things that we'll touch on here is body condition scoring. And so body condition scoring, as we look at it, and the top female is way too emaciated. That one's certainly a 1 on a 1 to a 5 scale. And then our ewe on the bottom, certainly one that fits into a 5 and a 5+ if there was such a thing. Obviously an obese kind of a lady there that is going to cause challenges. And both of these animals have problems relative to where we would need to have them no matter what the year. But we can be able to evaluate those, primarily keep them around 2.5 or 3 and go a little bit more than that if we so need to as well at different points at times. But again, a 1 to 5 levels, and you can go back and look at this, or provided this is from the University of Kentucky as well. So our target body condition score, and as we got back up there from the late gestation to early lactation, is that it's going to decrease some, but we want to make sure that we are providing enough nutrients, because they are, again, making sure that they're working for the ewes, and they're also working to considerably provide a great amount of milk for their progeny. It's going to take, no doubt, more resources for those twin-born, triplet-born, or quadruplet-born and or raised goats and lambs. And so make the decision, and you might want to see what you can do to make sure that you're transitioning those. And again, like I said, weaning is important for the lambs, and so you can get a high-quality group of finished lambs. And this is primarily from lambs that were in the Minnesota, central Minnesota area, but also that our ewes and does can be at a high level as well. And so with that, I have a little bit of information here, or advice for my friend Dr. Joe Armstrong. I got this, from this goat. This goat told me, and now I can pass it to you. So you got to step up your game, brah.